Vault-Tec always presented itself as humanity's last insurance policy. Advertisements promised safety, scientists promised stability, politicians promised that when the world ended, the lucky few inside the vaults would inherit what remained and rebuild civilization. The brochures showed families smiling together under clean fluorescent lights, children holding balloons, reassuring slogans etched across steel. It was a picture of order surviving chaos. But scattered across terminals, audio logs, government memos, and half-finished research notes is a different story. One full of contradictions, missing explanations, and unsettling hints that Vault-Tec's true purpose may have gone far beyond simple survival. When those fragments are pieced together, a question emerges quietly and refuses to go away. Were the vaults really meant to save humanity, or were they designed to study how humanity breaks? The first cracks show up in their stated mission. Vault-Tec publicly claimed that each vault was intended to house tens of thousands of people, preserving entire communities underground. In practice, the vaults were built for only a fraction of that capacity. The discrepancy was not an oversight. It was baked into the plans. Instead of large societal shelters, each vault became a micro-laboratory, sealed ecosystems containing anywhere from a few hundred to barely enough people to sustain genetic survival. Some vaults experimented with authoritarianism, others tested addiction treatment, social stress, group psychology, cloning, cryogenic suspension, or isolation. Still others were left almost untouched, control groups placed deliberately alongside the chaos. Everywhere, the guiding hand appeared meticulous, analytical, and disturbingly detached from compassion. Internal documents refer casually to inhabitants, not as citizens or refugees, but as test subjects. That phrasing matters. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding Vault-Tec is how deeply it intertwined itself with the pre-war government and especially the Enclave. Many Vault-Tec executives held high-level government relationships. Certain Vault directives came directly from classified federal committees. Funding flowed through military black projects. In return, Vault-Tec received unparalleled authority, power to build secret infrastructure, power to conceal true project purposes, power to essentially disappear thousands of citizens beneath the ground without accountability. And yet, puzzling contradictions sit right next to this structured control. In multiple archive files, different divisions of Vault-Tec seem unaware that other divisions exist. One laboratory refers to long-term genetic monitoring, while another insists the vaults were strictly sociological studies. Engineers believed their projects would open only after short-term environmental stabilization, while oversight boards referenced timelines spanning centuries. It's as though multiple hidden agendas overlapped, some known only at regional levels, others guarded by small circles of executives, and a few possibly known only to the highest-ranking figures whose names rarely appear directly in records. Those missing or redacted names are another mystery. Key meetings are referenced, but attendees listed only as initials or blank spaces. Reports mention final directive approval without saying who approved it. Certain vault logs cut off mid-explanation. It gives the impression that pieces of the puzzle were intentionally removed, leaving behind just enough to suggest a plan, but not enough to fully understand it. That becomes especially apparent when examining the GEC. The Garden of Eden creation kit was pitched as a miracle tool. Insert it into the wasteland, and it would terraform ruined land into something livable. Clear the radiation, grow crops, build foundations, reseed the world. Many vaults were issued one, reinforcing the promise that the inhabitants' purpose was not to hide forever, but to emerge and reclaim the surface. And yet, technical analysis shows a more sobering truth. The Gek was far smaller, more limited, and more fragile than the myth suggested. It contained useful tools, seeds, blueprints, molecular devices, but its results depended heavily on circumstances: soil quality, radiation levels, climate resilience, and the skills of the vault residents themselves. Calling it a world rebuilder seems exaggerated, almost deliberately misleading. Was the Gek simply overmarketed, or was it a psychological device, something to provide hope, to keep populations compliant, believing they were part of a heroic future instead of experimental subjects? If the latter is true, then the vaults begin to resemble a carefully managed series of human trial chambers disguised as salvation shelters. Another disturbing thread winds through the archives: the idea that the vaults may have represented only Phase 1. Certain memos reference post-trial application environments and integrated stabilization deployment. Others describe timelines far beyond the expected survival of any single vault population. The wording hints at long-range planning, something that would continue after data had been collected and analyzed. What comes after testing? Implementation. But implementation of what? Some theories suggest Vault-Tec hoped to engineer the optimal society model by exposing different groups to extreme psychological, environmental, and ethical stressors, then observing outcomes. It could determine which systems produce the most control, productivity, loyalty, or resilience. The results could then be used by whoever inherited the surviving world, potentially the Enclave or another governing body, to shape society deliberately from the ashes. Other theories suggest something far more personal. Vault-Tec executives may have intended to preserve themselves elsewhere, separate from the experimental vaults, watching safely from remote facilities. The vaults, in this scenario, became less noble project and more data farm, a vast test meant to refine strategies for maintaining power in the new world. Evidence supporting this idea appears faintly in scattered references to secure executive bunkers, though none have been definitively found. There is also the unsettling possibility that even Vault-Tec itself did not fully control its own secrets. Deep projects often layer secrecy not to protect the public, but to obscure true intent even within the organization. Different departments were told different rationales. Different overseers received different training. Data reports traveled upward, but instructions came down from unseen higher authorities. By fragmenting knowledge, no single employee could expose or question the entire structure. That fragmentation may explain why notes appear in which individual scientists express confusion or doubt over their roles. Some documented guilt, others rationalized their involvement as patriotism or necessity. A few seemed to believe they truly were saving humanity. They may have been partially right, but in a way far colder and more selective than they realized. Consider how many vaults never opened naturally. Consider how many experiments placed residents in scenarios guaranteed to fail or devolve. Consider how many external crises, raiders, radiation, famine, were ignored by automated systems designed to remain sealed, even if rescue could have been possible. The vaults recorded everything: behavior, rebellion, cooperation, breakdown, recovery attempts. Every decision made by frightened people in impossible circumstances became a line item in research archives. That level of data obsession implies purpose beyond mere survival. It implies design built around learning at any cost. Yet there remain gaps impossible to connect with certainty. The missing memos are deliberate. The contradictions in experiment goals may reveal internal struggle or carefully orchestrated confusion. The faint connections to the Enclave raise questions, But even within Enclave archives, references to Vault Tech alternate between admiration and distrust, as though each entity believed it was manipulating the other. And always lingering in the background is the question of the Gek. Was it intended as a hopeful lie to stabilize Vault populations, or as proof that at least some part of Vault Tech genuinely wanted a future rebuilt rather than merely studied? Perhaps the real truth lies somewhere in between. Maybe Vault-Tec did believe it was guiding humanity toward survival, but through a philosophy that treated suffering as acceptable collateral and human lives as variables. To such thinkers, experiments were not cruelty, they were preparation. A disastrous world, in their minds, required ruthless knowledge. If civilization was going to rise again, someone had to understand which kinds of societies held together longest when every comfort vanished. That haunting logic runs like a quiet refrain through what survives of Vault-Tec's internal communications: detached tone, calculated reasoning, and a chilling confidence that the end could justify nearly any means. Yet there is still a deeper mystery, the possibility that even those architects lost control. The bombs may have fallen sooner than expected. Communications collapsed, data pipelines severed. The masterminds, confident in their oversight systems, may have perished or become isolated, leaving their great experiment drifting without conclusion. In that case, the vaults represent something tragic and ironic, a grand plan whose designers never lived long enough to witness, a sprawling network of isolated communities continuing their trials autonomously, guided only by automated scripts and long-dead doctors' intentions. The world above changed faster than the experiment did, and the vaults, still humming in darkness, continued doing exactly what they were programmed to: testing, recording, observing, long after the meaning behind those directives faded. The truth about Vault-Tec's master plan remains scattered and incomplete. Each vault sheds light on a different aspect, like fragments of a broken mirror that can never quite form a whole image. What is left behind is not certainty, but mood. A lingering unease that the company tasked with saving humanity may never have seen humanity as something to protect, only something to study, shape, and ultimately control. Whether the GECK was hope or illusion, whether the Enclave orchestrated the deepest layers, whether a Phase 2 was ever intended to begin, all remain unanswered questions, suspended in records too damaged or too secret to fully decode. What endures, instead, is the haunting suspicion that the vaults were never simply shelters from the apocalypse. They were part of it. When the bombs fell, the Enclave believed it was not witnessing the end of the world, only the clearing of the board. In their eyes, they were not just another faction. They were the continuation of the United States government, descended from classified councils, military command structures, and corporate industrial elites who considered themselves the rightful heirs of the continent. They had the resources, the bunkers, the scientists, the technology, and most importantly, the ideology that convinced them they were the only ones qualified to decide who deserved to inherit the world. For a while, they seemed untouchable. Hidden facilities remained operational. Secure communications stayed active. Generals and policymakers survived in hardened shelters. Oil rigs hummed quietly off the coast. Laboratories beneath the earth continued their work, and secret bases coordinated from shadows. But gradually, something happened that no internal projection ever seemed to anticipate. The Enclave began to disappear, not all at once, and not in dramatic explosions. It vanished slowly, piece by missing piece. Officers whose names stopped appearing on rosters, research branches that failed to report back, logistics chains that ended in silence. Even within their own records, the leadership structure becomes murky after the first major defeat at the Poseidon oil rig. Files end abruptly. Classified communications reference individuals who never appear again. Reports trail off with vague phrases like status unknown or assets redeployed. The destruction of the rig was catastrophic. Most known high command had gathered there, operating under the belief that isolation equaled invulnerability. The rig was more than headquarters. It was symbol, command hub, research center, and ideological shrine to the belief that the Enclave stood beyond consequence. When it fell, logic would dictate that the organization fractured beyond recovery, except fragments survived, and those fragments behaved as though higher leadership still existed somewhere. In the years following the rig's destruction, Enclave operations continued across various regions, often coordinated, often well-funded, often disturbingly consistent in philosophy and protocol. That should have been impossible without a central governing authority. Yet covert research continued. Advanced equipment surfaced. New outposts appeared in distant territories. Chain of command procedures remained intact. It raises a question that lingers across every recovered file. Who was still giving orders? There are theories. One suggests that several top-ranking officials escaped before the rig fell. Evacuation contingency plans certainly existed. High-priority escape routes are referenced in encrypted communication logs, including prototype aircraft and submarine access points. The Enclave leadership, accustomed to redundancy, may have seen the rig not as final refuge, but as one node among many. If key decision-makers evacuated early, they could have continued operations quietly elsewhere. But where would they go? Rumors persist in scattered documents of remote mountain bunkers, inland energy facilities repurposed as military command centers, and uncharted island installations converted from Cold War infrastructure. Some of these hints appear in unrelated terminal entries, stray remarks, ambiguous coordinates, or mentions of secured sectors that never correspond to known maps. If any still functioning central hub existed, it has not yet been identified in the wasteland, suggesting extraordinary secrecy or deliberate dismantling. Another theory proposes that leadership did not disappear, it decentralized. The Enclave, recognizing that large power structures made ideal targets, may have fractured itself intentionally into autonomous cells. Each regional commander would then hold partial authority, following the ideology without full visibility into broader strategy. That model produces resilience but obscures continuity. To outsiders, it looks like collapse. Internally, it maintains loyalty without the risk of total annihilation. This theory explains something unusual. The Enclave's ideology remains strikingly consistent across regions despite isolation. The same language, same justification, same disdain for wasteland populations appears repeatedly, even decades apart. That kind of continuity usually requires either a central doctrinal authority or rigid indoctrination protocols embedded so deeply that the system perpetuates itself automatically. Still, decentralization alone does not explain the more puzzling element: the emergence of advanced technologies long after primary research hubs were destroyed. Power armor variants, energy weapons, medical systems, and aircraft appear in locations where there should be no surviving manufacturing capacity. Either those items were stockpiled somewhere unknown, or production resumed in facilities no one has discovered. The Enclave rarely behaves like a scavenger faction. Its equipment seems fresh, standardized, manufactured, which suggests someone still has access to industrial-scale infrastructure. Some historians, speculate that certain pre-war corporations partnered with the Enclave before the bombs, creating distributed production centers disguised as innocent research plants. Those companies would have become ghost entities after the war, leaving behind automated systems capable of continuing production under pre-programmed directives. If the Enclave leadership tapped into such systems, it could sustain itself without revealing fixed headquarters. Then there is the matter of ghost factions. Across the wasteland, survivors occasionally encounter Enclave-trained operatives who no longer claim the name openly. Some act as mercenaries, others as scientists embedded within rival organizations, and a few form splinter groups that blend Enclave ideology with local opportunism. These groups often possess selective knowledge, tactical training, limited access to codes, partial archives, but lack clarity on overall purpose. They behave like soldiers, still following orders long after command has disappeared. That leads to an unsettling hypothesis. Leadership may have died without the rank and file ever realizing it. The Enclave's communications protocols favored compartmentalization and impersonality. Orders arrived through encrypted messages, seldom accompanied by personal identification. If automated systems or compromised relay networks continued transmitting directives, field operatives might believe leadership remained active even when it no longer did. But there are counterexamples. Certain transmissions include language unmistakably personal, references to strategic philosophy, deliberate adjustments in doctrine, long-term projections inconsistent with simple automation. Someone was thinking, evaluating, refining. Whether that someone was original high command, a successor council, or even an AI-adjacent leadership construct remains debated. The possibility of artificial governance cannot be dismissed entirely. The pre-war government had flirted with automated strategic decision systems long before bombs fell. Some vaults housed experimental AI oversight modules. Military installations contained fail-safe protocols that could simulate command structures. If such tools existed within Enclave networks, leadership might have transitioned from human to machine gradually, a shift invisible to operatives already conditioned to obey instruction without questioning its source. Another possibility stands out because of its human simplicity. Internal coups erased parts of leadership intentionally. Power attracts ambition. The Enclave's ideology rewarded hierarchy, discipline, and loyalty, but also cultivated arrogance and political maneuvering. In chaos after the oil rig's fall, competing commanders may have seized control of assets, eliminated rivals, and rewritten archives to conceal the struggle. Suddenly, missing officers are not mysteries, they are victims of internal consolidation. The absence of clean records would be deliberate. Evidence exists in subtle references to stabilization efforts and realignment operations, bureaucratic language that often masks purges. Certain names vanish from archives immediately after these notes, replaced by new signatures endorsing identical policies with slightly altered rhetoric. If coups occurred, they did not change the Enclave's ideology, they simply selected who wielded it. The tragedy buried in all these scenarios lies in how little ordinary people mattered to the Enclave's calculations. Leadership collapse rarely triggered reflection or ethical reconsideration. Instead, strategies shifted toward survival of the institution itself. Citizens above ground were regarded as contaminated remnants. Vault dwellers, unless genetically ideal, were expendable. Even internal personnel were disposable if they threatened command cohesion. This detachment may explain why the Enclave never truly rebuilt civilization, despite possessing the tools to do so. Leadership obsession with purity, control, and hierarchy left no room for rebuilding with the people who actually survived. Every plan revolved around erasing and replacing rather than repairing. And yet, traces of doubt flicker occasionally in personal diaries and confidential logs. Lower-ranking scientists question directives. Some officers express discomfort with sterilization protocols or genocide proposals. A few even hint at whistleblowing attempts that end abruptly in silence. Those scraps suggest that not everyone within the enclave fully embraced its harsh vision, but their voices rarely lasted long enough to influence policy. So what truly happened to the original leadership? The honest answer is layered. Some surely died in explosions and structural collapse when the oil rig burned. Others likely fled and disappeared into safe houses whose locations remain unknown. Some may have reorganized far from public knowledge, guiding the ideology from shadows while letting smaller branches take the visible risk. Others were perhaps consumed by power struggles never recorded, and in at least a few cases, leadership may have become something abstract. Systems continuing motion without the people who once initiated it. The result is neither triumphant nor fully defeated. It's something stranger. The enclave persists as echo, fragments of command, traces of doctrine, scattered enclaves of loyalists acting according to old manuals written by leaders who may no longer exist. Like ghosts that never realize they're gone, they continue walking predetermined routes, repeating orders written decades earlier, convinced of a destiny that no longer has architects. What remains unresolved is whether that destiny could ever return in full form. If hidden leadership still exists somewhere, buried deep within a mountain, under the ocean, or behind layers of disinformation, it has stayed eerily quiet. Perhaps it waits intentionally. Perhaps it assesses the wasteland and finds it unready, or perhaps it has dwindled to individuals too few or too weary to attempt control again, holding on to archives not as tools of conquest, but as relics of a failed plan. There is one last question that lingers behind all others. If the Enclave truly believed itself the rightful government, why did it never attempt widespread public negotiation? Why cling to secrecy even when secrecy repeatedly failed? The simplest explanation may be the darkest one. They never saw the wasteland as something to lead, only something to overwrite. Leadership built on that belief cannot sustain itself forever because it refuses to recognize the people it intends to rule. Over time, isolation becomes weakness, hidden bases become traps, secret plans decay. Eventually, what remains is ideology without infrastructure, memory without direction, authority severed from reality. And somewhere, scattered across lost bunkers and forgotten terminals, the names of the original leaders still exist, but buried beneath layers of erasure, redaction, and silence. Their fate remains a story that ended without witnesses. The wasteland contains many horrors, but most have names. Radiation, raiders, ghouls, super mutants. Each threat can be measured, cataloged, and explained by science or history. Even the worst of them belong to the world humanity destroyed. They are consequences. They are understandable. Then there is the Dunwich Company. Its name appears quietly, often without emphasis, like a footnote in a ledger. A loading company, a mining business, a modest corporate venture from before the bombs. But wherever Dunwich built, invested, or dug, something strange remained afterward. Unease carved into walls, voices lingering in darkness, and structures that feel less like buildings and more like gateways. Unlike many corporations of the old world, Dunwich left behind little public-facing identity. There were no patriotic commercials, no stirring slogans, no smiling mascots. It operated out of warehouses, quarries, and excavation sites, It moved stone, metal, supplies, a physical logistics brand that made its money not by selling dreams, but by moving the heavy foundations beneath them. And yet, in scattered emails, workers mention the artifact. In diaries, they mention the dreams. In recordings, they whisper that they were digging towards something that existed long before Vault-Tec, before the Enclave, before any government at all. What Dunwich really was, and what it believed it found, remains one of the Fallout universe's most unsettling, unsolved mysteries. The company's first hints surface in fragments. At several excavation locations, workers experience recurring nightmares. They describe standing at the bottom of pits, staring into darkness that somehow stares back. They talk about hearing voices speaking in languages no one recognizes, languages they can still somehow understand. They feel drawn deeper underground without knowing why. Many report déjà vu, as though the mines were not new projects but returns to places humanity had once known. Dunwich management did not reassure their employees. Instead, supervisors quietly arranged psychological screenings, documented behavior changes, and continued to expand operations. Employees complaining too loudly were rotated out or reassigned, but never fired. Dunwich kept them close, as though their mental deterioration was not collateral damage, but part of the process. Records show significant shipments of stone with no clear destination, labeled only with cryptic tracking markers. Financial logs list mysterious research partners without names. Orders for structural reinforcement appear around areas where there should have been nothing worth reinforcing. Empty shafts, sealed-off caverns, forgotten tunnels dug deep beneath older tunnels. Something was beneath the earth. Dunwich wanted it. The sense of ritual begins appearing shortly before the war. Construction blueprints shift from practical designs into layouts that seem deliberately symbolic. Staircases spiral in uneasy patterns. Hallways bend back onto themselves. Doorways lead into chambers shaped almost like shrines. At least one facility incorporates stone blocks cut from excavations that workers insisted should have been left buried. Those blocks come up repeatedly. They are dense, dark. Some contain carvings so worn and eroded that no one can decipher them. Engineers describe feeling uncomfortable around them, as if the stone itself retained a presence. A few logs note instruments glitching when placed nearby, with readings spiking for no clear reason. There is also something else. Visitors to Dunwich sites sometimes feel that the air is thicker than it should be, not heavier, but older. They report faint, metallic echoes even when standing in silence. The deeper one travels, the more the world above begins to fade, sunlight, memory, and certainty slipping away. By the time the bombs fell, the Dunwich Company was no ordinary mining organization. Its facilities contained restricted rooms, not listed on official maps, stored crates without labels, and employed foremen who spoke in calm, measured tones about the work continuing, regardless of circumstances. Then the world burned, and the work did not stop. Decades later, explorers wandering through Dunwich ruins feel something that has little to do with radiation or decay. They describe seeing flickers, not hallucinations in the usual sense, but visions that seem synchronized among different witnesses. People experience the same images at the same locations, workers chanting, supervisors watching with expressionless faces, and strange stones being lowered into darkness while torches burn in underground chambers. These visions do not behave like trauma. They behave like memory, but not personal memory. It is as if the places themselves remember. What makes the Dunwich mystery more unsettling is that these visions connect across entirely different regions. East Coast structures whisper the same syllables heard in Western ruins, People hundreds of miles apart report identical dream sequences after sleeping near certain sites. It's as though the Earth is repeating a story humanity refuses to acknowledge. Some researchers speculate that Dunwich uncovered remnants of a forgotten pre-human civilization, something that once built vast stone temples and carved sigils into rock. Others suggest they discovered a cosmic entity, one indifferent rather than malevolent, whose presence exists beneath geology and time. Whatever it was, the company did not recoil. It leaned closer. The employees caught in the middle underwent gradual transformation. At first, they became uneasy, then distracted, then obsessed. Journals shift from complaints about wages into meditations about destiny, inevitability, and the call. Families reported loved ones speaking absent-mindedly in their sleep, reciting phrases that did not belong to any known language. Some grew paranoid of the sky, preferring to remain underground. Others grew increasingly violent in defense of ongoing excavation. Dunwich supervisors did not interpret this as a warning. They recorded it meticulously. Notes describe the stages, durations, and triggers of psychological change. They list exposure times, environmental variables, and stress thresholds. The tone is clinical, detached. The workers are clearly observed. The question is whether they were being protected or tested. Then there is the issue of sacrifices. Evidence surfaces in broken stone circles and bloodstains fossilized into floors. The recordings that survive suggest at least one site staged ceremonial killings, not under duress, but willingly, under the belief that something beneath demanded tribute. Those directing the events are rarely visible. Only silhouettes stand behind the chanting. Whenever the killings occur, the air seems to shudder, and afterward, workers report calm. In a world filled with irradiated monsters and broken technology, the Dunwich Company mystery feels different. It implies that the apocalypse did not awaken terror. It merely revealed something that was already there, waiting patiently beneath layers of civilization. The company's collapse following the bombs should have ended everything. But every so often, wanderers encounter new cults wearing fragments of Dunwich insignia. They speak of tunnels, deep places, whispers that feel like ocean currents running through their minds. Some claim they are not resurrecting anything, merely continuing an ancient relationship the surface world pretended to forget. The most unsettling detail is that Dunwich facilities never seem fully abandoned. Doors open and close as if someone recently passed through. Candles appear where no one should have left them. Terminals flicker to life briefly before shutting back down. It creates the impression that operations persist, quietly, invisibly, long after corporate infrastructure vanished. So what was the Dunwich Company truly doing? There are theories. One posits that it began simply as a business, like any other, and only stumbled onto something incomprehensible by accident. Faced with the unknown, greed and curiosity merged into obsession. Leadership convinced themselves they could control or harness whatever they found. Instead, they succumbed to it. Another theory argues that the company was founded deliberately by people already aware of what they were seeking. The lack of marketing, the quiet funding patterns, the secrecy, all suggest an organization designed from the start to approach buried places with reverence rather than skepticism. In that version, Dunwich was not an accidental explorer, it was a worshiper. There is also the possibility that none of it was supernatural at all, that Dunwich performed psychological experiments inspired by myth, using chemicals, suggestion, and environmental manipulation to simulate supernatural phenomena among its workers. But that explanation struggles against the sheer consistency of experiences across regions, and the fact that sightings, voices, and phenomena persisted long after chemical exposure would have faded. The truth likely lives somewhere between science and ritual, something natural but ancient, something not designed for human understanding but discovered anyway. Dunwich left scars not through weapons, but through unease. Walk through the remnants of a vault, and you see human mistakes, corporate greed, and political arrogance. Walk through the ruins of Dunwich, and you feel something older judging you quietly, indifferent yet aware. The difference is subtle but profound. Vault Tech treated people as experiments, Dunwich treated them as offerings. And the question that lingers long after leaving those twisted corridors is not what the company found, but whether it ever left. There's no documented shutdown order, no corporate apology, no final record acknowledging failure. Only silence and continued evidence that people still wander into the ruins, still hear the voices, still descend, and sometimes never come back. Dunwich remains, in every sense, unfinished. Its tunnels stretch downward into darkness that feels strangely patient. Its stones hum with history that refuses to reveal itself. And somewhere deep beneath collapsed ceilings and drowned chambers, whatever the company awakened or merely followed, waits without urgency. It has all the time in the world. The wasteland may be new, but the thing beneath it is not. Across the wasteland, communities come and go. Raiders burn towns, radiation wipes, settlements out, famine scatters survivors, and disease empties villages. Most disappearances can be explained, even when the exact details vanish into dust. But scattered across Fallout's world are places where settlements do not collapse. They simply stop existing. There are no burned walls, no piles of bones, no signs of looting, and no bodies left behind. Tables remain set. Doors are locked from the inside. Notes end mid-sentence. The land holds evidence that people lived there, worked there, laughed there, and then, without warning, were gone. Those are the disappearances that bother historians the most. The first unsettling element is the stillness. When a town falls to raiders, the aftermath is unmistakable. Spent shells litter the ground, bloodstains remain, buildings show forced entry. In vanished settlements, there are none of those things. Furniture is undisturbed. Supplies remain untouched, often neatly arranged as if residents expected to return shortly. Beds remain made. Sometimes cooking pots still sit over cold fire pits, filled with half-finished meals. The impression is not one of panic or invasion. It feels instead like life paused mid-gesture. Occasionally, travel logs mention caravans arriving at such places expecting trade, only to find absence. No guards at the gate, no smoke from chimneys, no animals in pens. The horses or Brahmin tether posts are empty. Rope ends frayed not by tearing, but by deliberate untying. It is as if the residents walked away quietly, taking only what they could carry, without leaving messages or explanations. But the most unsettling cases are the ones where footprints stop suddenly, fading into barren ground with no destination visible. Journal fragments do exist, offering glimpses into the final days of some missing settlements. They typically begin normally, discussing crops, trade shortages, disputes over water, or concerns about nearby threats. Then the tone shifts. Entries mention strangers passing through town who refuse to share names, unknown figures watching at night from hills just beyond torchlight, unmarked crates being delivered by traders who claim ignorance of their contents, children speaking about voices calling from outside walls, promising safety beyond the horizon. None of the writers describe outright violence. Instead, they describe an atmosphere that grows gradually heavier. Dreams become vivid. People mention hearing sounds at the edge of their perception. Not gunshots or explosions, but rhythmic noises like distant machinery or faint chanting carried on the wind. More than one writer confesses uncertainty about their own memory, unsure whether conversations actually happened or were imagined. A feeling of expectation begins to settle, like a community collectively convinced something important is approaching. Then the entries stop. One settlement leaves behind a locked meeting hall with chairs arranged in a circle and the minutes of a town vote half written on a chalkboard. Another leaves medical logs referencing unusual fatigue among nearly every resident. A third contains records of secretive visitors offering relocation opportunities with vague promises of advanced technology, stable food supply, and protection from radiation. No signatures accompany these offers. They are simply labeled representatives. Theories attempt to explain what happened, but none fit completely. The most grounded possibility is organized relocation. A powerful faction might persuade entire populations to move to controlled zones, promising safety from the brutal environment. The NCR has relocated towns for resource management. The Brotherhood of Steel has relocated groups when strategic necessity demanded it. The Enclave, in particular, has a history of resettling survivors for experimentation or control. Yet relocation leaves tracks: supply caravans, moving equipment, resettlement logs, survivors talking about the journey. In these vanishings, those traces rarely exist. Another theory involves disease. Certain biological agents could incapacitate populations quickly, leaving behind little evidence if bodies were later incinerated or buried far away. Records exist of pre-war bioweapons capable of neurological disruption, causing confusion and compliance rather than chaos. A disease that encouraged victims to follow orders blindly could move an entire settlement without resistance. But even then, someone would leave a clue: a body, a burn pit, or at least a rumor passing along caravans. Silence itself becomes suspicious. There are darker possibilities tied to forces less understood. Some survivors insist that deep beneath the wasteland lie vaults and facilities not built by Vault Tech, places with no records and no stated purpose. They speak of hidden elevators buried under rock, inaccessible without coded machinery. Towns near such rumored sites vanish more often than others. The idea is that entire populations are taken underground for reasons unknown, as test groups, sacrificial communities, or unwilling colonists in long-term isolation experiments. No solid proof of these subterranean havens exists, only whispers and second-hand accounts. But the pattern remains. Other disappearances occur near industrial ruins, where radiation levels spike unpredictably. Residents report seeing strange lights in the distance, or silhouettes moving through heavy fog at night. Some accounts describe groups walking willingly into the glow, believing they saw loved ones calling to them. Rational explanations trace these events to exposure-induced hallucinations, but that does not explain why those affected do not later collapse where they stood, and why entire villages leave no trace of death. If hallucinations led them away, then something or someone guided them far enough to erase their trail. There is also the chilling intersection between missing people and technology. Pre-war science pursued countless classified projects designed to manipulate human behavior, subliminal messaging, psychological conditioning, and experimental broadcast frequencies intended to alter mood and cognition. A handful of discovered devices emit frequencies described by listeners as comforting, persuasive, or impossible to ignore. If such technology survived the war, falling into the hands of an organization seeking labor or control, then quiet disappearances make sense. People would not need to be taken by force. They would simply choose to leave without understanding why. The Institute's shadow looms over many missing person stories, but not all align with its methods or geography. Some occur far beyond its influence. Others predate synth operations entirely. The Institute may have exploited an existing phenomenon rather than creating it. If a tool existed that could convince entire populations to follow orders, any powerful faction would covet it. Yet some disappearances break even those frameworks. There are places where the environment itself feels responsible. Settlements built near ancient craters, cracked earth fissures, or ominously quiet forests tend to report strange events before emptying. Residents report animals migrating away days before people do. Crops die overnight without rot or contamination. Air grows still. Travelers approaching such locations after disappearance often describe overwhelming dread or vertigo, sensations that vanish once they leave the area. No machines, factions, or visible threats explain these anomalies. They feel like spaces the world simply rejected. The emotional impact on nearby communities runs deep. When one settlement vanishes, others nearby often react not with investigation, but with silence. They avoid discussing the lost town. Roads leading toward it fall unused, even when shorter and safer than alternatives. Maps quietly remove its name. Oral histories refuse to include it. It is as if acknowledging the disappearance invites it closer. Fear becomes ritual, and avoidance becomes a form of collective protection. Occasionally, lone survivors surface, though rarely with clarity. They speak in fragmented recollections, filled with gaps. One remembers standing among neighbors in a field at night, all gazing toward an unseen horizon. Another recalls following lights along a ridge and waking miles away with no memory of how they traveled. A third mentions a voice promising shelter beneath the ground before everything went quiet. Attempts to interrogate these survivors reveal trauma rather than conspiracy. They genuinely do not know what happened. The most haunting cases leave behind children's toys placed carefully on beds, journals with comforting farewells addressed to no one specific, and community boards with messages about upcoming gatherings that never occurred. Each vanished settlement becomes less a crime scene and more a ghost in architectural form. What makes these disappearances endure as mysteries is their refusal to resolve. Every time investigators develop a plausible cause, another example emerges that contradicts it. Some vanishings leave signs of structured evacuation. Others resemble mass wandering. Some appear targeted, while others feel almost random. They occur across eras, across regions, under different governments and environmental conditions. Whatever force stands behind them seems uninterested in recognition, only in removal. The wasteland is littered with scars from catastrophes humanity understands too well. Bombs, hunger, tyranny, and greed leave visible fingerprints, but these places do not feel ruined, they feel erased. Perhaps one day a lost bunker will be uncovered, its corridors filled with hundreds of people who believed they were being led somewhere better. Perhaps a hidden archive will reveal a deliberate relocation program run by a faction too meticulous to leave witnesses. Or perhaps the truth will remain intangible, the wasteland's quiet reminder that even after everything humanity survived, there are still things it cannot explain. Settlements do not simply vanish in nature. Animals scatter, structures decay slowly, footprints persist, and yet the wasteland holds spots where human presence fades, as if someone erased it carefully with an unseen hand. Travelers pass through, see empty chairs and dust-covered photographs, and leave feeling as though the town itself is waiting for residents who stepped away only for a moment and somehow never returned. The greatest horror of these disappearances is not the violence that might have occurred, but the silence that follows. Silence means there is no clear threat to fight. Silence means no one knows who might be next. Silence means some corners of the world are governed by rules that exist beyond knowledge and beyond control. In a place as fragile as the post-war landscape, that realization is more terrifying than any raider gang or mutant horde. There are maps hung in forts, caravans, and ranger stations marking dangerous territories, irradiated zones, raider strongholds, feral nests. But there are also unmarked patches, ordinary landscapes that feel wrong without explanation. People learn to avoid them instinctively. They do not speak of vanished settlements. They do not ask where they went. They simply keep moving. And somewhere, tucked beneath the layers of forgotten ledgers, scattered memos, and unfinished journal entries, the final movements of those communities exist, but hidden just far enough beyond reach that each disappearance remains an open question. Were they relocated, taken, lured away by promises, or did they walk willingly into something neither science nor history can fully describe? The wasteland keeps its answer, and the towns remain empty, not destroyed, not conquered, just gone. Super mutants are one of the most recognizable horrors in the Fallout world, towering figures of muscle and rage, warped by the forced evolutionary virus. Their existence represents science's ambition mixed with cruelty, an attempt to manufacture strength at the cost of everything that makes a person human. In regions where they are known, communities tell stories not about what super mutants are, but about how they came to be. Usually, the story is simple and direct. A lab experimented, the virus escaped or was misused, and the wasteland paid the price. But then there are the places where that origin story does not quite fit. Scattered across multiple territories are super mutant populations that appear where no official FEV facility existed, no recorded laboratories, no research installations, no vault-like containment systems. And yet the mutants are there, organized, reproducing through kidnapping and forced transformation, sometimes even forming societies. Their existence implies something unsettling. Either the virus traveled farther than anyone realized, or someone continued its development in silence, leaving no trace except the beings it created. To understand the mystery, one must begin with what is known. The forced evolutionary virus originally emerged from pre-war military research, aiming to create soldiers immune to radiation, disease, and aging. The program was as ambitious as it was morally hollow. Early test subjects mutated unpredictably, gaining strength and resilience while losing fertility and often psychological stability. Different labs adjusted formulas independently, which is why super mutants across regions differ. Some intelligent and strategic, others feral and uncoordinated. Documented facilities exist. They include labs where results can be studied, logs read, and moral failures witnessed clearly. Those places, however, do not fully account for every mutant encountered. The question becomes, how did FEV spread beyond controllable zones into locations seemingly untouched by major experimentation? One possibility is migration. Super mutants, particularly organized ones, do not always remain confined to their point of origin. Groups might wander in search of supplies or captives. Over generations, such wandering could carry the virus outward as mutants capture new humans and subject them to vats or exposure chambers they replicated from memory. But migration alone does not explain why some regions contain high concentrations of mutants without any evidence of early waves moving through. Instead of trails, there are simply clusters. That leads researchers to consider whether undiscovered FEV labs remain hidden. The world before the war was riddled with secret projects buried in remote landscapes. Not all were documented publicly or even internally. Compartmentalization meant that agencies often hid research not just from citizens, but from other agencies. It is entirely plausible that additional test facilities existed, disguised as unrelated industrial or medical centers. If bombs buried them rather than destroying them, their automated systems might have remained intact, continuing work long after human oversight vanished. Imagine a forgotten bunker, sealed tight, waiting for signals that never arrived. Its machines, designed to monitor experiments, might misinterpret environmental failure as continued threat. Any scavenger stumbling inside could trigger automated security systems that double as containment systems, turning unintended victims into new subjects. Over decades, a population of super mutants could emerge from an empty lab that outlived its creators. Another explanation touches on surviving scientists acting independently. Consider individuals who truly believed in FEV's intended purpose, not as a weapon of domination, but as humanity's salvation. Some researchers may have looked at the collapsing surface world and concluded that only engineered biology could withstand it. Such individuals, driven by misguided hope or obsessive logic, could have recreated the virus using stolen data and makeshift labs. Without peer oversight or ethical boundaries, their experiments would carry even fewer safeguards than official ones. The resulting mutants might differ dramatically from known strains, displaying unique behavior patterns or characteristics. Evidence supporting this theory appears through cryptic logs referencing off-site testing and independent replication environments. These hints imply that certain scientists continued their work beyond authorized zones, possibly even dragging communities into their effort. If so, each small private laboratory becomes a seed for a future mutant enclave. The most unsettling possibility, however, challenges the very idea that FEV belongs solely to structured laboratories. There are hints in scattered scientific journals that strains of the virus escaped containment prior to the war and interacted with the environment unpredictably. Water tables contaminated by runoff from experimental facilities, wildlife exposure in testing regions, and atmospheric dispersal events might have carried microscopic traces far beyond intended zones. Over time, those traces could accumulate, mutating naturally like any biological agent. People exposed accidentally might display partial transformations, and opportunistic groups might later learn to harness these environmental mutations deliberately. That theory helps explain rare supermutant variations, lacking the structured vat-induced look of lab-created strains. Instead, some mutants appear more uneven, grotesque in unique patterns, as if transformation occurred more slowly and inconsistently. These individuals sometimes maintain fragments of memory others lose, suggesting a less aggressive but still harmful exposure model. If such environmental evolution continues quietly, pockets of new mutants could appear spontaneously, independent of any lab. Regional myth adds additional layers. Communities that live near supermutant territories often attribute their presence to curses, ancient weapons, or bad lands where the earth itself is angry. These interpretations, while unscientific, accurately capture something true. Wherever supermutants appear, landscapes tell stories of lingering trauma. Towns nearby learn to accept them as part of the environment, like storms or predators, despite not fully understanding where they came from. That normalization makes tracing origins even harder because locals rarely investigate beyond survival. Then there are the mutants themselves. Some exhibit hints of remembered pasts they no longer fully comprehend, flashes of childhoods, distant parents, or professions. Conversations overheard in mutant strongholds occasionally touch on dreams featuring laboratories, masks, and pain. Their fragmented recollections, though unstable, suggest they were once ordinary people taken rather than volunteers. Listening to them, one hears echoes of distant facilities where transformation was carried out systematically, not chaotically. That consistency implies deliberate organization behind at least some unexplained mutant groups. Occasionally, explorers stumble upon abandoned mutation vats filled with dark residue. No logs remain, no corpses lie nearby. Only the architecture speaks: pipes, drains, restraints, all familiar to those who have studied known FEV installations. These empty sites resemble stage sets after actors left, as though whoever operated them dismantled everything cleanly. It's difficult not to imagine mobile mutation units designed to relocate as needed. Portable FEV labs would allow shadow factions to transform captives, then vanish without trace, leaving behind only unknown mutant communities as evidence. Another curious aspect lies in expansion behaviors. Certain super mutant groups quickly establish territory around places with research potential: old libraries, hospitals, or military archives, as if instinctively drawn to knowledge. They may not fully comprehend why they guard these ruins, but something within their altered minds prioritizes them. Perhaps buried inside their biology are lingering directives from researchers who designed the virus to create guardians, not just soldiers. If that is true, super mutants appearing in random locations might not be random at all. They may be positioning themselves according to subconscious instructions encoded into the virus itself. Genetic studies, where possible, show variations between regional mutants so dramatic that they appear almost like separate species. That degree of divergence suggests multiple origin points rather than a single outbreak, yet all share core hallmarks pointing back to FEV. Whatever paths led them to different lands, they remain connected to the same flawed ambition. The moral implications grow heavy the deeper one thinks about them. If unknown labs continue operating, they may still be creating super mutants right now, unseen by any major faction. If environmental contamination slowly births new ones, then even victory over existing mutant enclaves means little, because nature itself has absorbed an artificial virus into its long, unpredictable cycles. No government can completely contain what has already become part of the landscape. People of the wasteland learn to live alongside mysteries like this, not because they are comfortable, but because they lack power to resolve them. Travelers avoid certain valleys and ruined cities where mutants are rumored to roam. Settlers build walls thicker, farmers create watch shifts, but no one truly solves the question, because solving it would require uncovering truths some forces want deeply buried. Truths about experimentation, human expendability, and the idea that progress once justified atrocities hidden underground. Super mutants are reminders of a time when society believed evolution could be engineered by force rather than allowed through natural resilience. They march across the wastes like sentinels of scientific arrogance. The mystery of their scattered origins only intensifies that symbolism. Even when major labs fall, the consequences linger. Unseen hands may still stir the virus, whether intentionally or accidentally, shaping outcomes far beyond anyone's control. Perhaps somewhere lies a forgotten archive that lists every hidden facility, every rogue scientist, every unsanctioned experiment. Until it surfaces, the wasteland remains dotted with questions in the shape of towering figures who patrol broken roads. Travelers pass them cautiously, wondering not only how they were made, but who decided such beings were acceptable risks for the sake of theoretical advancement. In the end, the most unsettling realization may be that the virus never needed conspirators to spread. Once released into the chaos of a collapsing world, it followed its own logic, migrating much like the species it altered. Each unknown mutant enclave becomes another quiet marker on a map no one ever intended to draw. The people whose lives intersect with these mutants rarely think about the original laboratories anymore. They think instead about survival, building barricades, staying hidden, firing shots when needed. The past that created this new reality remains buried beneath layers of rubble and denial. But every time a new mutant appears in a place it supposedly should not exist, that buried history pushes upward again, reminding everyone that the line between scientific ambition and catastrophe is thinner than they ever imagined. Super mutants were meant to be soldiers. Now they are monuments, and every mysterious cluster of them that rises in unexpected lands asks the same quiet question of the world that made them. Where did you think all your forgotten experiments would go? In the wasteland, loss is ordinary. People lose homes, caravans, crops, and loved ones every day. Most losses have causes that can be traced if one is willing to follow the clues far enough. Raiders leave tracks, radiation leaves burns, disease leaves graves. But among every grim ledger of death and survival, one pattern quietly unsettles those who study the ruins. Children disappear more often than they die. They vanish from towns, camps, caravans, farms, and traveling communities, frequently, silently, and without leaving much behind beyond confused parents and unanswered questions. Stories of missing children are whispered in nearly every region. Sometimes a child in a settlement wakes up at night, hears something outside, and simply never returns to bed. Sometimes a caravan stops to rest, and by morning, one of the youngest travelers is gone from the group. There are recorded cases of orphanages that gradually dwindle, not through illness or violence, but through children slowly drifting away over weeks, one at a time, like candle flames quietly extinguishing. The strangeness lies not in the disappearances themselves, but in what doesn't accompany them. There is rarely evidence of struggle. No signs of animals dragging bodies away, no ransom notes, no footprints pointing toward raider encampments. In many of these instances, the children appear to have walked away by choice, sometimes leaving shoes neatly by the door, or placing cherished belongings in careful piles as if tidying before leaving for a journey they believed was temporary. Adults searching footprints outside settlements sometimes notice something even more unsettling. The tracks continue for a time, and then at some point, they stop. Not in a river, not on rock, not where wind could have erased them. They simply halt mid-trail as though whoever made them stepped out of the world. Theories try to separate rumor from reality. Some researchers look first at survival logic. Children, especially in post-war environments, grow up surrounded by constant talk about scarcity. If a community reaches a breaking point, food shortages, water rationing, internal conflict, children might conclude, consciously or unconsciously, that leaving helps the group survive. Self-sacrifice is not unheard of, and history is full of orphans adapting with brutal maturity. Perhaps the missing ones walked into the wild, believing they were sparing those they loved. But that theory collapses whenever one begins examining disappearances that occur in settlements not facing crisis. There are cases where food stock was stable, defenses strong, and morale relatively high. In those places, children did not leave under pressure. They vanished from otherwise stable worlds without leaving explanations. Even more puzzling, the pattern continues across decades and separate regions, as if reacting to something more universal than local circumstances. The existence of orphan caravans complicates the mystery further. These groups, informal collections of children traveling together after losing families, appear occasionally in stories, trade records, and missionary logs. They move intentionally, often avoiding major roads and staying hidden. Many caravans are rumored to be guided by older teens or adults who refuse to identify themselves. They trade rarely and only for essentials. Their routes seem pre-planned and consistent, as if following charts handed down by someone else. People who encounter these wandering children report something that feels less tragic than expected and more organized. The children talk among themselves in quiet tones. They stick to schedules. They carry carefully rationed supplies. They act not lost, not frightened, but purposeful. Witnesses describe feeling as though interrupting them is a mistake, as though they are not fleeing danger, but heading toward a destination they cannot discuss. Where those caravans originate and where they end remains unclear. There are stories of safe houses scattered through remote landscapes, shelters stocked just enough to support small groups. Some are found hidden beneath abandoned barns or built discreetly into canyon walls. Inside, there are children's drawings stuck to walls, stacks of blankets folded neatly, medical supplies partially used, and meal wrappers from multiple generations. No adults appear to run these refuges, yet they are maintained somehow, repaired, and kept usable. Whoever sustains them understands both secrecy and long-term planning. This leads naturally into the suspicion of organized factions. The Institute's shadow falls heavily across discussions of missing children, especially given its interest in genetics, identity, and replacement technologies. Rumors persist of scouts identifying children with specific characteristics and removing them quietly, substituting cover stories or encouraging families to believe their children wandered off. But the timeline does not match consistently. Too many disappearances predate known synth operations, and too many occur far beyond the Institute's plausible reach. The Institute may account for some missing children, but not the phenomenon as a whole. Other factions have motivations that make uncomfortable sense. A harsh world constantly needs labor, soldiers, and subjects for experiments that ethical societies would never permit. Groups like raider clans and slaver companies undeniably abduct children when they can, but abducted children leave traces. There are markets, rumors, rescue attempts, and historical trails. The children in these mysteries simply do not reappear in chains, records, or graves. One recurring detail emerges in scattered journals written by older survivors. Children, shortly before vanishing, speak about hearing someone calling them, not an audible shout, but a guiding sense. They talk about dreams of warm underground rooms, bright clean lights, and people saying, "You belong with us." Some mention roads they have never traveled, yet somehow believe they recognize. Parents shrug these as fantasies until the night the child follows the imagined path and disappears. Could children be especially sensitive to psychological manipulation technologies left over from before the war? There were indeed pre-war programs exploring emotional suggestion and subconscious broadcasting. A child's developing brain might respond more strongly than an adult's. A signal intending to lure volunteers might inadvertently take only the most receptive and trusting individuals, the youngest ones. Another theory suggests that missing children are linked to attempts at building societies untouched by the cynicism of the old world. If someone, Vault-Tec remnants, scattered enclave scientists, or anonymous utopian groups believed adults were too damaged by the apocalypse to rebuild ethically, they might try creating communities composed entirely of children raised from scratch. Such ideas sound disturbingly plausible when one reads certain declassified documents about social conditioning experiments. A new civilization raised in isolation by machines or carefully chosen caretakers might seem safer than trusting the ruined generation. However, there is no hard evidence of entire child-only colonies existing, no recovered vault logs, no open settlements composed of rescued youths. If these societies exist, they stay hidden on purpose. Some propose a far quieter answer. Children leave because they no longer recognize traditional communities as home. Many wasteland settlements rely on rigid survival discipline, constant fear, and normalized violence. To a developing mind, the difference between captivity and protection may blur. When rumors spread of other places, places without shouting guards or strict ration punishments, children chase the idea of peace. In their innocence, they may join any group promising kindness, and that group may not always deserve the trust offered. But even then, the question returns: where do they end up? Occasionally, tragic remains surface: a shoe near a cliff, bones near a dried stream, proof that some children simply succumb to the wilderness. Yet the proportions never align. Too many disappear, too few remains are found. Entire registries of missing children exist in places like NCR, administrative offices, and charity organizations, filled with names no one ever recovers. There are stranger accounts too, stories that drift toward folklore. In rural areas, elders speak of pale figures appearing near settlements at dusk, figures shaped like people but moving too smoothly, carrying lanterns that never flicker. Children claim the figures stand outside walls at night, not touching, not speaking, just waiting. Adults rarely see them. Animals reportedly avoid them. And after such sightings, at least one child in the area soon vanishes, gone without a trace, as if they followed those silent guides willingly. Rational minds dismiss these tales as superstition layered on top of trauma, yet the consistency of detail across distant regions unsettles even skeptics. It is as though different cultures across the wasteland invented the same ghost story independently, or experienced the same hidden presence. What makes the mystery heavier is how communities react. Adults develop unspoken rules. Children are instructed not to wander after dark. Windows are covered earlier. Songs parents once sang at night fall out of tradition because they remind them too much of the quiet afterwards. The disappearances weave themselves into daily life, not as events with logical explanations, but as natural phenomena people endure, like storms or drought. That normalization might be the saddest aspect of all. For the missing children, there are no memorials. There are no graves to visit, no farewell rituals to offer. Their absence remains unfinished business. Families sometimes keep rooms preserved, beds made, toys arranged exactly as they were. They resist moving on because moving on feels like admitting certainty, and certainty never comes. Every noise beyond the walls might still be a returning child. Every wandering traveler might be someone who has seen them. Occasionally, travelers do bring stories of young adults appearing decades later with vague memories of secret communities where they were taught to read, farm, craft, and obey rules without question. These individuals often remember structured schedules, lectures about safety, and caretakers they describe as disturbingly calm. Most recall no pain, no abuse, only an overwhelming sense of constant supervision. When they eventually left, usually through accidental circumstances, they found themselves unable to locate the place again. Were these isolated rescue shelters run by well-meaning strangers, or fragments of a larger system attempting to cultivate a generation in controlled isolation? No clear documentation resolves those accounts, and without proof, they slide into rumor. Ultimately, the mystery of the missing children reveals something about the wasteland itself. It shows that even in a brutally practical world, where every resource is counted and every danger cataloged, there are still forces operating in shadows, some human, some technological, some perhaps psychological, and some simply unknown. These forces do not announce themselves. They do not demand ransom or power. They only remove a population that represents innocence, adaptability, and the future. Whether that removal is meant to exploit or protect remains unclear. It is easy to imagine hopeful possibilities, secret sanctuaries where children are shielded from the horrors above. But history within Fallout rarely grants uncomplicated mercy. Hidden programs often mask darker intentions. Experiments on human resilience, breeding projects, indoctrination systems, or attempts to engineer loyalty might all require populations young enough to mold. In that light, the disappearances take on an even more haunting tone. They become not tragedies of loss, but components of plans humanity never agreed to participate in. And yet, a quieter possibility lingers too. Perhaps some children disappear because they are the only ones still willing to believe there is somewhere better. In a landscape defined by ruins, they refuse to accept walls and watchtowers as permanent reality. They walk out into uncertainty because the world behind them feels like a smaller prison than the horizon ahead. If that is true, then their fate is both heartbreaking and strangely hopeful, symbols not of control, but of resistance. The wasteland keeps its secrets. Towns bury their pain, old soldiers write reports, merchants whisper cautionary tales around campfires. Across all of it, the question repeats itself endlessly: where do the missing children go? No one answers. No one truly knows. Only the empty beds remain. In the shattered world after the bombs, weapons become currency. Entire factions rise or fall based on who controls rifles, ammunition, and repair infrastructure. Most weapon suppliers in the wasteland reflect the chaos around them. Improvised shops, dangerous back alley traders, or raider workshops running on scrap and desperation. Then there are the gun runners. They stand apart. Their factories operate with precision. Their output is refined, standardized, and reliable. Their merchandise shows craftsmanship not usually seen outside surviving military caches. They distribute powerful arms not only to militias and governments, but to anyone who can afford the price, from mercenaries to private settlers, while rarely involving themselves directly in politics. Their headquarters occasionally relocate, yet their routes remain organized, guarded, and surprisingly efficient. Over time, a question emerges that lingers behind every ledger and contract. How does a company maintain that level of structure in a world built from ruins? Stories about the gun runners often begin with their origin as a small group of arms specialists who survived the early post-war period. According to the most accepted accounts, they began as mercenaries and ex-military technicians who understood something few others did: that long-term survival depended not on hoarding weapons, but on controlling the ability to manufacture and maintain them. Resource scarcity would cripple armies. Ammunition would degrade. Complex firearms would break without proper machining tools and expertise. Whoever repaired and produced these tools would hold influence beyond brute force. So they built factories. But factories require more than ambition. They demand electricity, machinists, raw material sources, logistics chains, and a steady flow of trained technicians. In the wasteland, where nearly every settlement fights simply to obtain clean water, the idea that a stable industrial complex could thrive seems almost improbable. Yet the gun runners did not merely survive. They expanded. Their brand became synonymous with quality. Their distribution methods improved. Their personnel grew disciplined and organized. That's where suspicion begins. A thriving arms manufacturer implies financial backing far deeper than ordinary scavenging could provide. The gun runners maintain guards, engineers, accountants, and negotiators. They produce complex weaponry, requiring specialized metals and carefully calibrated internal parts. They maintain machining infrastructure intricate enough to rival pre-war facilities. None of that appears overnight, and none persists without significant, continuing support. Some researchers believe the gunrunners inherited pre-war corporate assets, hidden supply depots, unfinished military contracts, or automated factories that never received final shutdown instructions. The idea suggests their founders stumbled across dormant production systems and managed to restart them. Yet if that were true, why have no other factions discovered similar resources on comparable scale? The wasteland is full of scavengers digging through ruins. A secret factory capable of long-term production would not remain undiscovered easily unless someone actively protected it. Others theorize that the gunrunners evolved from within the military-industrial complex, perhaps consisting of former defense contractors who retained access codes and engineering plans. These specialists might have escaped into fortified corporate shelters, later emerging with enough knowledge to reconstruct parts of their industry. Their precise designs and machining accuracy certainly align with pre-war standards. But this theory alone does not explain the network's resilience across decades, or why they remain so studiously neutral in political affairs. Neutrality is strategic. It prevents enemies from forming coalitions against them. As long as everyone buys, everyone tolerates their existence. The gunrunners supply both sides of conflicts regularly, providing weapons to anyone willing to pay without overt loyalty tests. That pattern raises further questions. Organizations that arm the powerful usually face pressure to choose sides. Governments demand priority supply. Dictators demand control. Rebel groups attempt to seize production. Somehow, the gunrunners avoid being conquered outright. Perhaps it is because trying to conquer them rarely works. Their facilities tend to be heavily automated, fortified, and strategically positioned. Their guards are disciplined, and rumors suggest internal fail-safes designed to destroy production lines rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Raiders attempting to overrun facilities often discover the same thing. Attacking the gunrunners does not just bring retaliation, it disrupts the regional balance of power. Factions dependent on their arms supplies swiftly intervene to restore operations, since losing them hurts everyone. That kind of deterrent implies careful planning, which leads to a more conspiratorial possibility. Someone else benefits from keeping the gunrunners alive. Some historians point toward the NCR, arguing that an industrial nation quietly subsidizing a powerful weapons manufacturer would stabilize its sphere of influence. Rather than nationalizing arms production, an expensive, politically volatile process, the NCR could simply allow the gunrunners to exist as a private entity while providing logistical support, energy, or legal protection. In return, the NCR enjoys reliable weapon supplies without bearing full responsibility for how they are distributed. However, evidence against this idea appears quickly. The gunrunners sell to NCR enemies with equal friendliness. They refuse exclusive contracts. They charge military and civilian buyers alike. Their refusal to show preference would logically frustrate any government supposedly backing them. If the NCR truly funded them, one would expect at least partial influence over output priorities. Yet records show instances where NCR units go without shipments while private buyers receive full crates, suggesting the gunrunners are not waiting for anyone's permission. Another theory ties them to remnants of the Enclave. On paper, this makes certain sense. The Enclave possessed advanced technology, secret manufacturing capabilities, and ideological motivation to control arms distribution indirectly. By funding a neutral private weapons company, they could cede influence across regions while avoiding direct association. Some recovered documents reference arms shipments suspiciously similar to gunrunner products located near known Enclave activity zones. The quality and consistency align too closely to ignore. But the flaw lies again in ideology. The Enclave rarely tolerated uncontrolled weapon circulation. Their doctrine centered around tight authority, not free markets. Arming wasteland citizens they considered genetically impure does not match their strategies. If anything, they preferred disarmament and sterilization. Supporting the gunrunners would contradict their deeper beliefs. Unless, of course, a splinter Enclave faction abandoned ideological rigidity in favor of profit and long-term positioning, a possibility that cannot be dismissed entirely, though evidence remains elusive. Corporate ghosts offer another angle. Before the bombs, arms manufacturers competed fiercely. Some were established giants with intercontinental connections, secret projects, and offshore manufacturing capabilities. If one such corporation survived partly intact, perhaps through automated offshore platforms or desert bunkers, the gunrunners might represent that company's quiet reemergence. Their brand, however, lacks overt corporate symbolism. If a pre-war company operates behind them, it either erased its identity deliberately or lost the executives capable of asserting ownership. The most grounded explanation may be the least dramatic, yet still deeply unsettling. The gunrunners finance themselves through relentless trade discipline and ruthless economic logic. They control a product everyone needs and no one can replicate easily. Every war, skirmish, or border clash becomes revenue. They reinvest profits into improved machining, bribe regional powers for safe passage, contract caravans for raw material acquisition, and continually train new technicians from populations eager for stable employment. Over years, those practices could produce an industrial empire without hidden benefactors. Even then, questions remain about their information networks. The gunrunners often know when conflicts are rising long before they escalate. They position shipments strategically. They anticipate demand spikes. Traders whisper that gunrunner representatives sometimes arrive in towns days before hostilities begin, already prepared with catalogs of equipment suited to the exact conditions those communities will face. That level of foresight could stem from extensive spy networks embedded across factions, or from someone feeding them inside information for reasons unknown. Their ethics appear pragmatic rather than cruel. They do not enslave. They do not initiate wars. They simply refuse responsibility for consequences. If someone uses their weapons to commit atrocities, the gunrunners respond by shrugging and adjusting inventory orders. In their worldview, conflict existed before they arrived and will exist long after they're gone. Their role is to sell tools, nothing more. Yet that argument feels too convenient, too rehearsed. It suggests a philosophical justification developed over years, perhaps to quiet internal discomfort. Within rare private journals attributed to former employees, unease appears between the lines. Some technicians express guilt knowing the rifles they assemble will likely end lives. Management counters by emphasizing economic necessity and regional stability through balance. The company encourages emotional distance as professional discipline, molding workers into participants who maintain moral separation from their product. Shadows gather around the highest levels of gunrunner leadership. Few people ever meet the individuals who dictate strategy. Local managers claim decisions arrive via encrypted communication, similar to how the Enclave once issued orders: impersonal, concise, unquestionable. There are no public names, no visible councils. The top ranks are shadows behind thick doors. This secrecy fuels every theory imaginable, from surviving pre-war industrial magnates to artificial intelligence frameworks optimizing profit beyond human emotion. What makes the mystery profound is not merely who finances them, but how they maintain continuity in a world hostile to institutions. Governments collapse, warlords burn out, cults fracture, but the gun runners continue quietly, adjusting around every storm. They demonstrate that stability can exist in the wasteland, yet it exists only in service to violence, as if the only industry capable of true recovery is the industry of conflict. Perhaps that is what disturbs observers the most. The gun runners are proof that organized infrastructure could be rebuilt, yet almost no one uses similar discipline to reconstruct hospitals, universities, or transportation networks. The wasteland can restore factories, but chooses weapons factories first. Whether orchestrated by hidden patrons or created solely through market pressure, the result remains the same: a world where survival and armament intertwine until they are indistinguishable. So who finances the gun runners? Possibly no single entity, possibly many, through layered arrangements so old they function automatically. Governments desperate for supplies, criminal groups seeking profit, industrial remnants clinging to relevance, secretive engineers who prefer influence over visibility, all might contribute indirectly through trade deals, protection contracts, or quiet political favors. Over time, that web becomes its own machine, requiring no singular mastermind, just countless participants who benefit from keeping the arms flowing. In that sense, the gun runners may represent the purest form of post-war capitalism, a system fueled by conflict that sustains itself by ensuring conflict never truly ends, not out of malice, but out of momentum. And somewhere beyond the factory walls, people keep buying, not because they want to, because they feel they must. The mystery persists, not because the truth is hidden behind conspiracies, but because the truth might be too ordinary and too bleak. The gun runners exist because the wasteland demands them, and because no one has built anything powerful enough to replace the need for constant weaponry. Until that changes, their forges will keep burning, travelers will keep whispering about the unknown figures funding them, and caravans carrying crates stamped with their insignia will continue crossing the desert like arteries in a body that refuses to heal. The railroad is often described as a ghost organization, known less by what it openly does than by what people whisper about it afterward. It exists in fragments, passwords, chalk symbols, rumors traded in back rooms, and stories told in hushed tones about synths who escaped lives of servitude and somehow vanished into safety. To outsiders, the railroad appears whenever injustice becomes unbearable, then disappears again before anyone can catch its full shape. What makes the group fascinating is not simply its mission, but the unanswered question hovering over every fragment of its history. Who built something like this, and how long has it truly existed? Official records paint the railroad as a product of modern tensions around artificial people, an activist movement formed specifically to protect synthetic beings from slavery, dehumanization, and violent recall. That narrative feels convenient, neat, and contained, but beneath it lies evidence suggesting a much older lineage, one that predates the dramatic rise of synth technology and the Institute's increasing presence on the surface. The railroad may not have begun as a pro-synth organization at all. It may instead be an inheritance, an ideology passed quietly through generations, adapting to each new form of oppression that arose. Scattered documents reference anonymous individuals using words like freedom line, underground passage, and safe conductor, long before anyone publicly acknowledged synths as people. These phrases appear in unrelated logs across different regions, coded just enough to avoid detection. They describe routes, handoff stations, and shelter protocols for high-risk assets escaping control systems. the parallels with the modern railroad are too strong to ignore. Wherever people were trapped, in factories, in war camps, in research facilities, someone was practicing the art of moving them to safety through secrecy and trust. It is possible the railroad began as small resistance cells formed during the final chaotic decades before the bombs, when corporations and government agencies increasingly blurred together. Experiments required quiet subjects. Forced labor programs disappeared under euphemistic paperwork. Relocation camps sprang up under the banner of security. In that shadow, there would naturally arise individuals who refused to cooperate, workers, clerks, medics, and soldiers who saw what was happening and decided that smuggling one person out was worth the danger. Perhaps the railroad was not founded in one meeting, but grown organically from hundreds of quiet acts like these, all connected loosely by moral instinct rather than organized leadership. Over time, those instincts might have evolved into a culture. Symbols emerged as tools, chalk marks that could be erased quickly, phrases that sounded meaningless to outsiders, small statues or decorations that signaled safe spaces without saying so directly. Networks formed slowly, always intentionally incomplete, so no single capture could expose every route. That fragmentation, often criticized as weakness, may actually be the reason the railroad still exists. It is difficult to destroy something that refuses to centralize its power. When synths entered the picture, the transition seemed almost natural. Here was a new class of beings created in laboratories, designed for obedience, stripped of rights, and treated as objects despite clearly human traits of feeling, memory, and fear. The railroad, whatever its earlier form had been, simply recognized another injustice in familiar shape. Its mission shifted outwardly to focus on synth liberation, while its older traditions of secrecy, clandestine movement, and coded communication remained intact. Yet there are signs of internal disagreement throughout its history. Some members appear motivated purely by empathy, believing that any thinking, feeling being deserves freedom regardless of origin. Others approach the mission through political lenses, seeing synth emancipation as a means to destabilize powerful institutions they distrust. Still others are deeply pragmatic, focusing not on philosophy, but on preserving the organization's survival at any cost, even if that means abandoning individuals when rescue becomes too risky. These tensions create fractures that occasionally break into the open, revealing how fragile the railroad truly is beneath its polished myths. Leaders rise and fall quietly. Many are never named publicly. Some disappear mysteriously, leaving behind philosophical shifts but no recorded explanations. There are hints of betrayals, insiders who lost faith, who questioned whether risking human lives to save synths crossed a moral line. The organization absorbs these crises by changing shape rather than confronting them openly. In that way, its history becomes less a timeline and more a series of masks worn by the same underlying impulse to protect the vulnerable in secret. What raises deeper questions, however, is how often the railroad seems pre-positioned for events long before those events unfold. Safe houses exist in locations that later become strategic choke points. Contacts wait within institutions poised to become oppressive regimes. Even their philosophical language, metaphors about train lines, journeys, and conductors, resonates eerily with pre-war material from old social justice movements. It is as if someone, decades earlier, anticipated conflict cycles repeating and built structures meant to outlast specific causes. If so, the railroad is less a reactionary group and more a cultural artifact, something designed to endure power shifts without losing its identity. Not all perspectives view them kindly. Governments regard the railroad as destabilizing. Frontier towns see them as meddlers, endangering innocent people by drawing retaliation. Scientists sometimes accuse them of misunderstanding technology and interfering with research that might benefit society in the long run. Factions built on rigid order view them as chaos incarnate, a group that erodes authority quietly, one life at a time. Even individuals they rescue occasionally speak of lingering confusion, struggling to build new identities in unfamiliar places. Freedom solves one problem but exposes many new ones. The railroad accepts these costs not with triumph, but with a kind of quiet melancholy. Their work is not heroic in the glamorous sense. It is exhausting, repetitive, and rarely rewarded. They live in safe houses disguised as ordinary ruins, never entirely safe, always listening for clues that someone needs help. Their victories cannot be celebrated publicly. Their failures cannot be mourned openly. Every rescued individual continues life somewhere far away, meaning the rescuers often never know whether their efforts truly changed anything. One of the greatest unsolved mysteries concerns external influence. Some files suggest that unknown benefactors occasionally tip off the railroad about impending crackdowns or new synth tracking methods. The information arrives too precise, too timely, to be mere luck. This raises suspicions that someone inside powerful institutions quietly supports them. That benefactor might be a disillusioned institute scientist or a government official unable to oppose policies publicly, or even an artificial intelligence calculating probabilities and nudging events toward more humane outcomes. If such a presence exists, it remains deliberately hidden. No one claims credit. The railroad simply follows leads that happen to arrive when needed. Another question lingers around their training. Members display unusual skill in forgery, psychological persuasion, escape planning, and sabotage, disciplines not commonly available in scattered wasteland communities. If the railroad truly recruits from ordinary citizens, then somewhere must exist an instructional tradition, a set of lesson plans handed down through mentors over time. This again suggests age. Organizations built overnight do not develop nuanced operational cultures. They improvise. The railroad does not improvise. It moves like something that is practiced for generations. There is also the disturbing possibility that the railroad itself has been manipulated at times. If someone wished to siphon off rebellious synths, identify sympathizers, and map underground networks, supporting a resistance organization, or even infiltrating and steering it, would be effective. A carefully placed leader could subtly guide operations in ways that conveniently reveal valuable information to enemies. That thought haunts some members who wonder whether their successes occasionally serve another agenda they cannot see. But paranoia is both a tool and a danger in such environments, and they continue working despite the uncertainty. At the heart of the railroad lies a single philosophical question: what makes a being worthy of liberation? Every decision branches outward from that question. If a consciousness is capable of suffering, does it deserve moral protection? If a manufactured mind has memories, does identity belong to the creators or to the one who experiences it? These issues extend far beyond technology. They echo older human struggles over autonomy and ownership. By focusing on synths, the railroad inadvertently reopens unresolved ethical debates the world has carried since long before the bombs. Perhaps that is why their movement endures, because it touches something universal. No matter how much time passes, there will always be someone considered property, someone considered expendable, someone considered less than fully alive. And there will always be people unwilling to accept that framing. The railroad, stripped of specific labels, becomes simply a name given to that timeless defiance. Their hidden history is not preserved in monuments or museums. It is encoded in passage routes, carved through sewers, abandoned tunnels, forests, and city ruins. It is stored in battered notebooks, whispered meeting locations, and passwords scratched faintly into stone. Each generation inherits fragments, adapts them, and passes them forward. If the organization ever disappeared entirely, another would likely form in its image without realizing it, because the conditions that created it would eventually reappear. The mystery of the railroad lies not in secret headquarters or conspiratorial masterminds. It lies in the quiet truth that empathy can organize itself into structure even when governments collapse. It is proof that resistance does not always roar. Sometimes it survives by staying small, patient, and nearly invisible. Standing in an abandoned safe house with faded maps pinned to walls and old chalk marks lining door frames, one senses the presence of countless unknown individuals who once passed through, frightened, hopeful, uncertain. Their names may never be recorded, but the routes they walked formed a living archive. Each path represents an unwritten chapter of history that exists only in memory and motion, never in books. If the railroad has a legacy, it is not about technology or victory. It is about the preservation of the idea that some forms of life cannot be reduced to property, no matter how advanced or artificial or controversial they may be. That idea threads silently through the wasteland, like the rails of a track long buried, still guiding travelers who choose to follow it. And perhaps that is why, even though no one knows the full story, people feel comforted when they hear rumors of the railroad. Not because everything will be saved or fixed, but because somewhere, unseen, there are still people willing to risk themselves to help another person disappear into freedom. The Sierra Madre does not feel like a treasure. It feels like a warning written in architecture. Long before explorers stumble into its influence, they hear the signal, a haunting broadcast drifting across frequencies, repeating promises of luxury and survival preserved untouched since before the war. To the desperate, it sounds like salvation, untouched technology, sealed stores of food, a fortress against raiders and radiation. But beneath its polished veneer lies a trap that has outlived its creators and continues operating with unnerving precision, luring wanderers into its labyrinth long after the world that built it turned to ash. At the heart of its mystery lies a question as persistent as the broadcast itself: who ensured the Sierra Madre continued hunting people long after the last guests were meant to leave? Its construction was an act of arrogance driven by wealth and obsession. A billionaire industrialist designed it as both monument and mausoleum, an eternal symbol of control over chaos. The casino was meant to be more than entertainment. It was envisioned as a self-sustaining ecosystem: automated defenses, airtight chambers, cloud-like toxins controlled through environmental systems, and an intricate security network ready to lock itself down at the slightest perceived threat. In theory, it could become a sanctuary if war erupted, but sanctuaries built out of distrust often transform into prisons. When the bombs fell, the Sierra Madre did not open its doors to the suffering world. Instead, it sealed tighter. Guests and staff trapped inside were caught between poisoned air, aggressive security, and the paranoia of those who believed the casino's wealth could still be claimed if they simply outlasted everyone else. Rumors claim desperate factions formed within the sealed halls, manipulating systems, forcing rivalries, and treating the automated infrastructure like a divine authority that might eventually grant reward to the last survivor. Yet despite those tragedies, the systems did not fail. They endured. Power continued, Broadcast equipment resumed transmitting, traps reset, security routines remained vigilant. Decades passed, and still the signal played. The persistence of that signal cannot be accidental. Broadcasts require maintenance, deliberate programming, or resilient automation. Someone, at some point, ensured that the message was not only preserved, but amplified. This opens the door to possibilities that speak less about hospitality and more about design. One theory suggests that the original creator of the casino engineered the entire complex as a psychological and logistical experiment, not for guests, but for thieves. The broadcast operates like bait. It targets the desperate, the greedy, and the hopeful simultaneously, drawing them into a place meant to punish ambition. Every failed heist becomes data: how people move through danger, how they betray one another, how far they will go when convinced salvation lies within reach. If this was the goal, then the casino represents not a broken dream, but a machine executing its function flawlessly for over 2 centuries. Another perspective frames the Sierra Madre as a grief monument, built after profound personal loss. The architecture contains quiet echoes of mourning, art pieces about impermanence, rooms that feel designed more for memory than enjoyment. A heartbroken creator might have turned inward, deciding that if the world was destined to perish, it should at least face its end with beauty preserved. In this reading, the broadcast becomes less trap and more epitaph, an invitation to witness a paradise that never actually welcomed life. But those interpretations fail to explain the practical ruthlessness of the systems. Poison clouds, lethal holographic enforcers, electrified barriers, and sealed vaults do not serve symbolic roles. They enforce control. They teach lessons not through metaphor, but through pain. The fact that the casino continues resetting itself implies oversight beyond sentiment. Someone crafted redundancy upon redundancy, determined that the structure remain impenetrable even in the absence of human caretakers, which leads to the unsettling possibility that the Sierra Madre has no master anymore, but still behaves as if it does. Its security code loops through routines automatically, interpreting every unauthorized presence as threat. The broadcast functions as a recruitment lure because, in the casino's logic, there are still guests to be managed and tested. Its databanks hold instructions for staff long gone, and its automated systems obey them with unwavering, literal obedience. In this scenario, the intelligence guiding the casino is not malicious. It is simply uncompromising. Yet stories persist of adjustments within the system that appear too adaptive to be random. Gates lock at suspiciously opportune moments. Hostile holograms shift patrols based on intruder behavior rather than static programming. This suggests either the presence of lingering remote control systems or an advanced AI still quietly evaluating threats. If that is true, then the question becomes, why continue luring people after no humans remain to benefit from the treasure? Perhaps the answer lies in the vault beneath the casino, a sealed chamber representing both ultimate promise and ultimate trap. Wealth sits untouched inside, physically present and simultaneously unreachable without triggering deadly failsafes. Anyone who reaches it must choose between escape and possession. In that sense, the Sierra Madre does not just guard valuables. It reenacts a lesson endlessly, forcing those who enter to face an unresolvable paradox. Survival requires letting go, yet the place continually encourages obsession. Certain scholars who have studied the casino's recovered records suggest a final possibility. The broadcast may have been set to continue not merely as lure, but as confession, a warning disguised as temptation. The message draws people in, and through the journey, those who survive come to understand the destructive nature of clinging to past wealth, past power, or illusions of control. Those who die become part of the cautionary tale. Those who live carry the memory of the casino as a scar. It is not simply a trap, it is an argument against the greed that built the world before the bombs. But viewing the Sierra Madre as moral teacher feels uncomfortably generous. The wasteland is full of ruins, where ideology once claimed noble purpose while destroying countless lives. Whether designed as experiment, prison, or grave, the fact remains. The Sierra Madre signal continues to beckon, and real people continue to suffer because of it. Any intended lesson loses purity when written using human casualties. Another lingering mystery surrounds the systems that keep the toxins, the deadly cloud, circulating through the environment around the casino. Something actively maintains its flow, directing it into zones that trap intruders. The mechanisms are complex, drawing from multiple subsystems designed to recycle waste and seal contaminants. They appear almost deliberate in how they isolate corridors and choke streets. Those systems, too, would require maintenance, yet they persist. Someone wanted a perimeter that devoured curiosity itself. Travelers who escape the Sierra Madre often describe a lasting sensation afterward, a sense that the casino is still thinking, still watching. They feel haunted not by ghosts, but by architecture that seems to resent being disturbed. It is not that the building hates intruders, it simply refuses to acknowledge them as anything other than components in its ongoing process. The more one studies its layout, the more the structure resembles a ritual, a pilgrimage designed to transform anyone who walks through it, whether by enlightenment or by annihilation. Who, then, set the signal in motion, and why does it still play? The simplest explanation is that someone once pressed activate on a broadcast system configured to repeat indefinitely, never anticipating that civilization would collapse and leave the recording looping untouched. But the wasteland rarely accepts simple answers gracefully. Too many systems surrounding that broadcast remain not only intact, but deliberately adaptive. The casino feels maintained even while abandoned, like a puppet theater whose strings continue moving without puppeteers. Perhaps the truth lies in a mixture of intention and accident. A grieving visionary designs a sanctuary so secure it becomes predatory. Automated systems lock into self-preservation mode. A broadcast originally meant for grand opening night becomes, by sheer momentum, a continuous invitation that the world slowly reinterprets as myth. Over decades, scavengers, warlords, and wanderers all project their desires onto it: salvation, riches, redemption, and the casino obliges by fulfilling only the first part of the promise, the arrival. The Sierra Madre cannot adapt morally. It cannot change what it is. It can only continue. And maybe that is what makes it one of Fallout's most haunting mysteries. Not because a ghostly mastermind sits behind a terminal, plotting every new arrival, but because no one is plotting anymore. Human ambition built a machine for hoarding wealth and ensuring absolute control. Human catastrophe removed the guidance. What remains is a monument to obsession that still runs as designed, indifferent to the broken world surrounding it. Standing in its silent corridors, hearing the broadcast echo through the walls, one realizes something unsettling. The Sierra Madre is not waiting for anything. It has already achieved its purpose. It endures. It traps. It preserves. And somewhere beyond the reach of the radio signal, the wasteland continues to produce new wanderers willing to risk everything for promises whispered through static. They will keep coming as long as hope and greed exist, and the Sierra Madre will keep answering a machine in eternal conversation with humanity's oldest desires. In the end, asking who set the signal in motion may matter less than recognizing what it reveals. The casino broadcasts not only a recorded message, but the truth that even after the world collapses, illusions of wealth still have the power to summon people into danger. The signal is a relic, a trap, a memorial, and a mirror all at once. And as long as it plays, the Sierra Madre remains alive in the only way a place can be, through the stories of those who hear it and choose to walk toward it, unaware that they are stepping into a timeless loop built long before they were born